In the winter of 1893, in a shuttered county records office near Stoughton, Kansas, a municipal clerk cataloging tax documents unearthed a bundle of mismatched files bound with surgical gauze. Most were water-damaged deeds and irrelevant contracts. But at the bottom was a folded map, dated but unsigned. Its paper was linen-backed, official in format, and centered not on the town or county, but on the grounds of a long-demolished hospital. Room numbers were handwritten in faded graphite except for one. Room 12 had been printed in ink twice. Once on the west wing where it was known to exist, and once again faintly mirrored, on the opposite side of the building, where no hallway had ever been built. Between the two was a dotted line that ended in no doorway, no stair, no wall, just a handwritten note in the margin. Version discrepancy unresolved. Do not seal. The map was filed under architectural exceptions, non-permitted plans. It bears no initials. No engineer has ever claimed its creation, and no record remains OFWA was meant to walk a path that was never constructed yet drawn twice into the institution's blueprint. If you're still watching, you're already walking that path. Like the video to keep the map visible. Subscribe to follow it to the end. And if you're listening right now, tell me your country and the time. There's comfort in knowing we're all out there, scattered across timelines, watching the same story unfold. The ledger from St. Augustine's Infirmary in Kansas County begins with its usual solemnity. Thick parchment entries, iron gall ink, and clerical penmanship that did not waver even in matters of death. But on January the 9th, 1934, the register welcomed a new entry. It bore a name no redacted from every known copy, but remained legible in the original, a child, female, white, accompanied by no guardian. The anomalies began immediately. Under year of birth, then take nurse recorded 1865. Yet on the reverse side of the form, beneath the physician's initial notes, the same hand had carefully inscribed 1871. Both entries were made with the same nib, same ink, and in identical looping script. No correction was issued. No line crossed through the contradiction. Instead, a single marginal notation appeared 2 lines below. Unresolvable. Proceed with 1871 as the primary index. This directive bore the initials of Dr. L. H. Corwin, chief of the children's ward, a man known in private correspondences for his precision bordering on obsession. Corwin's personal case notes preserved only in fragments included the following line. Subject presents with impossible dualities, not developmental delay, but time indeterminate behavior. Displays memory of events not yet discussed. Requires passive observation. The girl was placed in room 12, a repurposed servant's chamber on the west end of the wing. It had no windows, no fireplace, and only one key held by matron supervision. Hospital policy dictated that children under the age of 10 were to be quartered in view of the infirmary nurse stations. Yet no one formally questioned her placement. Internal memos from the hospital board show no debate, no override, no discussion of her case at all. She arrived, and the record closed around her like a sealed envelope. Over the following weeks, inconsistencies accumulated. The girl's reported and now listed as 3 years old based on the 1871 date was belied by fluent speech, reading comprehension, and voluntary fasting. One nurse noted she refused milk, but requested clove water, a preference documented in patients twice her supposed age. In her nightly medical logs, her temperature readings varied by over 6 degrees without fever or infection. Her weight remained constant. Her handwriting, when allowed to copy letters, matched no known standard of penmanship taught in the region. More troubling was her relationship to time. During a preliminary mental health evaluation, she was asked, "What year is it?" Her answer, according to Corwin's Century, was neither "I don't know" nor 1934. She simply said, "That depends," and then asked the physician, "Which version of the year are you asking about?" Staff attributed her disorientation to trauma, yet Corwin did not concur. His notes shifted in tone after this encounter, abandoning clinical detachment for guarded ambiguity. He ceased referring to her by name or age. Instead, he began marking her chart with a shorthand symbol, 2 vertical slashes with a gap between WOW or W. That symbol does not appear in any other case Corwin handled over his 22-year career. In April, an administrative assistant attempted to create a duplicate file for the girl, citing irregularities in her paperwork. Her carbon copy was rejected. The hospital's internal index book used to assign case numbers skipped the next available line and left the following note in faded ink. This record does not repeat. It is unclear who issued that instruction. What remains is a singular artifact, a linen-bound file with 2 birth years, 1 child, and no assigned case number. At some point in 1876, the page itself was removed from the hospital's binding. In its place is a slip of blank paper glued in with care, carrying only these typed words. Transfer read under new authority. No signature, no date, no return destination, and no mention that she ever arrived. The child in room 12 spoke rarely, but when she did, it was with a cadence that unsettled more than it explained. Most patients, even the severely afflicted, offered glimpses of themselves, grief, pain, fear, confusion. This girl did not. Her silence was not vacant, but selective. Observing, waiting, the nurses recorded her behavior dutifully in the rotation log, noting that she did not cry, did not resist, did not seem frightened by injections or examinations. She neither bonded with staff nor recoiled from them. She complied, but never answered to her name. The only question she asked with unsettling consistency was always the same. Which version of the year are we in? The first few times the question was dismissed as a child's confusion, but over time its phrasing became impossible to ignore. She never asked what year it was, nor is it still 1934. She used the same language each time, precise, calm, and disturbingly expectant. Which version? Dr. Corwin, despite his fastidiousness, began emitting certain remarks from her public record. His personal notes, partially preserved in a water-damaged field book found years later in his estate, read, "Patient's grasp of time appears fractured, not in loss, but in abundance. Memory precedes context. Response to standard inquiry is rehearsed but non-performative." The other physicians, less comfortable with abstract classifications, began speculating in simpler terms. One suggested the child had endured a head injury. Another suspected seizure-induced hallucinations, but neurological testing, crude by modern measure, yet standard for the period, showed no irregularities, no stiffness in the limbs, no ocular tremor, no dilation beyond the natural range. The girl's cognitive evaluations became a source of quiet competition among the staff. On alternating weeks, she would complete arithmetic suited for a 12-year-old, then fail to identify a basic shape. Her handwriting, when coaxed, resembled that of a practiced Claire. Days later, she would stare at a pencil as if uncertain what it was for. Nurse Joanna Fields, who attended to her on the night shift, began recording her own informal observations in a pocket journal kept separate from the official logbook. She described the girl's peculiar sensitivity to repetition, not of routine, but of time itself. She does not like when the same hour repeats. When a clock is wound incorrectly, she becomes still, like she is waiting for it to catch up. This detail did not reach Corwin's desk. In March, a notation was added to the margin of the girl's chart. Temporal identity disorder, unclassifiable. No diagnosis by that name existed in the hospital's medical reference volume. When questioned later, none of the staff could recall who had written it. The ink matched no other pen used in her file, and the page on which it appeared had been affixed at a different angle than the others in the binding, as if inserted after the fact. More curious still was the growing fear among staff that her memory was not linear. During one evaluation, she listed the names of nurses who had not yet been assigned to her ward. 2 weeks later, those same women began rotation in room 12. The correlation was never formally recorded. Dr. Corwin, in what may be his most candid entry, wrote, "She speaks as if future is already past but unchosen. She does not ask to be believed, only to be correctly placed." After this, the frequency of his visits dropped sharply. He began declining his morning rounds in the West Wing, citing fatigue. His handwriting became less precise. His margins widened. Then, without explanation, room 12's clock was removed. No memorandum ordered its removal. No entry in the maintenance logs accounts for its absence. Only a small pale outline remained on the wall where the dust had not yet filled in the shape. In the 3rd week of May, a sealed envelope bearing no return address was delivered to Street Augustine's infirmary. The courier did not wear a uniform, but bore a federal insignia upon his satchel, pressed into wax, not stitched in thread. The envelope, by all surviving accounts, bypassed the clerical desk entirely and was placed directly into the hands of Administrator Byron H. Latimer, a man known for his loyalty to procedure and his distaste for deviation. Inside was a red-stamped dossier marked 427C child. The number, according to hospital indexing protocol, did not align with any known medical code. The C designation had been used only once before in a military boarding school record later destroyed in a fired. NO staff at St. Augustine's had ever handled a C file. Latimer, who kept approbate ledger of all federal communications, made no mention of this document in his records. By nightfall, the original intake paperwork for the child in room 12 had been removed from the hospital's filing cabinets. Not discarded, not misfiled, removed. When the attending nurse attempted to retrieve it for morning rounds, she found the drawer rearranged entirely with a placeholder sheet in its stead, bearing only a date. C. Archive 4227 Child, May 18th. No archive under that name existed in the hospital's registry. From that day forward, the child's name was no longer used, not by the nurses, not by the physicians. The chart outside room 12 was replaced with a brass plate, unnumbered, unlabeled. Staff were instructed verbally and only once, not to refer to her by any designation beyond her room assignment. Written orders, if any, were ever issued, have not survived. This absence itself became protocol. A quiet tension took hold. Those who had cared for the girl prior to the arrival of the envelope found themselves reassigned. Nurse Fields, who had compiled the most detailed behavioral logs, was rotated to the surgical ward without explanation. Her private journal ends abruptly on the same day the file arrived. No further entries mention the girl. Dr. Corwin's demeanor shifted again. He began attending room 12 without his usual notebook, relying instead on brief mental recitations that he would scribble down later alone. These entries, reconstructed from his pocket journals, became more abstract. One line written in cramped hand and half erased beneath a larger annotation reads, "There is a difference between not remembering and not being allowed to recall." The administrative wing, previously open to ward supervisors, became restricted. A new lock was installed on the filing room. According to a janitorial inventory from June, the room was entered only once between May 18th and July 2nd. On that date, the hospital's master log shows a brief entry in Latimer's hand. 4227C child, progress noted. Retain silence. No progress was ever defined. Elsewhere in the hospital, the language began to change. Physicians referred to the girl as the instance in shorthand. One memo from a junior staff member preserved due to a misfiled patient appeal contains the following line: "If we cannot classify her, we are not to speak of her." That is the new science. The phrase appears again a month later in an unsigned policy update issued hospital-wide, though its phrasing was softened, too. Cases pending federal oversight shall remain confidential and unnamed within intrastaff communication. The walls around room 12 were painted during this period, although there is no maintenance request on file. The color chosen was pale gray, the same used in the isolation quarters, though the child had not been deemed violent nor unstable. No mention of her exit appears in hospital records. The last time her room was signed into on the ward log was June 29th at 11:04 a.m. by a nurse whose signature matches none of the staff on file. After that, the logbook skips a page, not torn, not blank, just missing. The winter of 1875 arrived late to Kansas County, but with a stillness that unsettled even the most seasoned hospital hands. On the morning of February 3rd, the west-facing snowbanks outside St. Augustine's grounds remained unbroken until wheel ruts appeared near the administrative portico. There had been no knock, no bell, no warning, just a dark coach pulled by government-matched bays, stationed silently as if it had been there for hours. Two men emerged. Neither signed the guest ledger, though both passed through restricted corridors unchallenged. They wore neither uniform nor clerical badge, only heavy wool coats with inner lining trimmed in dark leather, a style associated with federal transport officials, but not standard to any known agency. The attendant at the front desk later remarked in a letter found posthumously among her papers that they walked as though the building belonged to them, but with no interest in seeing any of it. They did not speak to the girl. They did not ask to view her condition or meet the physician on record. Instead, they moved directly to the superintendent's office where they remained for 23 minutes. The hospital clock tower, kept accurate through monthly inspection, logged its last chime just before the door closed behind them. When they exited, one of the men carried the brass-plated file drawer labeled 4227C child beneath his arm. Nurse rotations were frozen that hour, no meals were delivered, no rounds recorded. It is the only missing entry in the otherwise uninterrupted daily log of Room 12. The superintendent issued no statement, only a brief note tacked to the staff board. 4227C child records have been temporarily relocated for public health continuity. Refer all inquiries to administration. The phrasing public health continuity had never before appeared in hospital communications. It does not appear again. 10. From that moment forward, the child's presence became spectic. Though still under observation, she was no longer formally charted. Her name remained absent. Her meals arrived, but with no dietary annotations. Sheets were laundered, but the cleaning staff signed no delivery slips. The girl was present, but unacknowledged, as though any language that risked defining her had been ruled inadmissible. Dr. Corwin, visibly diminished by this stage in the timeline, ceased all case-related entries. His later handwriting became skeletal, words no longer neatly spaced, but slanted downward as though avoiding the margins. One page in his personal notes reads, "Only, they did not need her consent. They did not need mine. They only required silence." It is the last mention of her in his surviving records. Questions began to surface within the institution, not openly, but through omissions. Medical students assigned to the West Wing were abruptly reassigned. The ward Claire, who had previously maintained immaculate log books, began leaving entry lines blank, only to return later with ink blots, obscuring entire columns. A janitor reported seeing one of the escorting men return alone weeks later, though no official record of his presence exists. The man was said to have retrieved an object from behind the heating grate in Room 12, placing it carefully into a wooden box marked only with a brass plate. 2. When the administrative office was eventually inspected in 1877 after the death of Superintendent Latimer, no documents relating to 427 child remained. The file cabinet itself had been replaced, its drawers narrower and of newer make. Only a single hinge from the original was discovered, wedged beneath a floorboard, corroded and stripped of its pins. More peculiar was the fact that the official coach logs for February 3rd showed no recorded visitors to the hospital, nor any coaches assigned to the region. The ink in the logbook for that week appeared consistent with the rest, except on one page, where a faint impression beneath the date line reveals a phrase later erased. She didn't look surprised to see them. In the spring of 1892, during repairs to the dilapidated east wing of St. Augustine's Infirmary, a carpenter pried up a warped floorboard in the abandoned corridor once used for intern quarters. Nestled between the joists was a tin container no larger than a ledger box wrapped in linen yellowed from age and silence. There was no lock, no inscription, just a binding twine knotted in a sailor's loop, tight and methodical. Inside, preserved by dry rattan insulation dust, lay the diary of Nurse Lydia E. Marsh, dated 1934, that her name does not appear in the official employment roster for that year, nor in payroll ledgers, nor in the census roll for Kansas County. Yet the ink was aged and consistent. The paper matched the infirmary's own stationery stock from the time. Her entries began mundanely. Patient bowel irregularities, draft complaints, laundry tallies. But by early March, the tone sharpened. One entry read, 2 girls admitted same week, different names on file, same eyes, same voice, same year, asking question. One directed to Room 12, other transferred. There was no file of a second patient matching that description in hospital logs from that month. No charts, no intake cards, no recorded visitations from families or guardians. Yet Nurse Marsh writes with clarity, not confusion. Her handwriting holds steady, neither agitated nor fanciful. She observed both girls separately. One wore a cotton shift, stained with carriage grease. The other arrived clean, bearing what the nurse referred to as a linen collar too stiff for a child. They never met, or at least were never seen together. Marsh remarks that each girl asked the same question within minutes of being left alone. Which version of the year is this? In later pages, the entries narrow their focus. The child in room 12, whom Marsh eventually ceases to call by name, ceases to speak entirely. The other, the one without a room, is noted only in hallway glimpses, shadows crossing behind door glass, and moments when meals prepared for one girl are found already opened, though Marsh insists she had not yet served them. One page creased in oil. Stain contains a sketch. Two side profiles of what appear to be the same child, one marked AM and the other PM. The figures are identical in all but one feature, the direction of the eyes. One faces left, the other right. Marsh's final entries suggest a growing mental strain. She writes of feeling observed in empty rooms. She begins to refer to the hospital clock as misaligned and insists that it measures only surface time. On April 19th, she writes, "I tucked one in, but there were two impressions on the bed." Hospital bed logs, which were cross-referenced annually for supply ordering, list only one mattress requisitioned for room 12 that season. By mid-May, the diary becomes erratic. Some pages are numbered out of order. Ink appears on the wrong side of the binding. One page, torn halfway down, states, "They took the second girl away, but the one who remained began humming the first lullaby." The final dated entry is May 28, 1934. It reads, "Only the child in room 12 looked up today. She said that version is closed." After this, the diary ends. No death notice for Nurse Marsh was ever filed. Her name does not appear in any obituary, pension application, or correspondence with the hospital board. Her handwriting does not match any other surviving nurse from that decade. The linen used to wrap the diary bore the embroidered initials LM, stitched with a thread color no longer produced in the state after 1872. Beneath the box, pressed into the wood beneath decades of dust, was a faint rectangular outline, the absence of a second box, its dimensions nearly identical, its contents, if they existed, were already gone. By the summer of 1875, the west wing of St. Augustine had resumed a predictable rhythm. The doors to room 12 remained closed, the brass plaque still unmarked, and the name of the child once housed within no longer spoken aloud by staff. Her file had long since vanished, her chart no longer clipped to the doorway, and her physician, Dr. Corwin, had formally transferred to a convalescent facility in Norfolk under the pretense of declining health. Yet in the hospital's dietary archives, kept in a separate ledge-bound volume from the patient records, a peculiar detail remained intact. Trays assigned to room 12 continued to be prepared and delivered well into November, more than 6 months beyond the child's recorded departure. Each day, 3 entries were logged by the kitchen porter assigned to the wing. Bread, broth, tea, sometimes substituted with clove water or milk-soaked oats, but always arranged the same. No utensils, no salt. No special instructions were appended, except for one, dated June 3rd, which read, "No noise upon entry. Avoid eye contact. Knock only once." The hospital kitchen operated under a system of return inventory. Trays were collected, examined, and signed back into thescalary based on remaining weight and condition. Of the 127 meals delivered to room 12 between May and October, 118 were returned with items missing, an expected pattern for an occupied room, but 3 came back empty and cold, and 6 returned sealed, yet noticeably warmer than when dispatched. No one could account for the discrepancy. The hospital furnace located in the basement did not feed directly into that wing. No vents ran beneath room 12's floorboards. There was no open flame, no electrical wiring, no residual heat source identified. One attending orderly, whose name appears only once in staff logs, added a marginalia beside an early October entry. Meal unclaimed plate warm to the touch, no scent. The discharge ledger for pediatric patients reviewed annually by the state board lists the child's removal from care as occurring on May the 2nd. The supervising physician line was left unsigned. The space intended for guardian retrieval information was crossed through with a thick line of graphite, and the word trans faintly visible beneath. No destination was recorded. In later audits conducted during the 1882 Consolidation Review of all state F-Fund hospitals, this discharge was flagged as incomplete. A red circle was drawn around her case, number 4227 child, followed by a handwritten note from the reviewing officer. Not traceable to any known receiving facility, possibly clerical redundancy. Investigate. There is no record that an investigation followed. Meanwhile, hospital laundry staff continued processing linens from room 12. No. Staff were formally assigned to clean it, and the custodial schedule made no mention of the room past May. Fresh bedding appeared on the requisition forms every 9 days, just as it had during her known occupancy. In September, the tray log included an unusual observation from a porter identified only by the initials EL. Returned tray bore faint condensation despite no warm item imprint on napkin, as though it had been unfolded then replaced. Following this entry, food service to room 12 ceased without explanation. No official memorandum canceled the delivery. The entry space for room 12 in the diatribe book was left open for 5 weeks, as if expecting a resumption that never came. The final note, written in a different hand than the rest, was added sometime later. It reads, "If she's not here, who's returning the dishes?" There is no notation of who wrote it. The ink used, a greenish-black tint, matches none of the standard pens issued by the infirmary that year. And beneath that entry, in the remaining pages in the dietary log, are torn out at the spine cleanly, without fray. In late 1875, the term cognitive dissonance of unnatural origin began appearing sporadically across institutional medical files in Kansas, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. The phrase did not exist in any published diagnostic lexicon of the time. It appeared suddenly, without definition, and always in the margins, never as a primary diagnosis, but as a whispered warning beside unrelated notes on behavior, disorientation, or time perception. The first recorded use was found in the private research log of Dr. Arasas Kell, a neurosurgeon at the Unionvale State Sanatorium in Pennsylvania. He had been documenting what he called non-sequential ideation among adolescent patients, several of whom had no prior history of mental illness. In one margin beneath a patient's sleep cycle chart, he scrolled unnatural dissonance between perceived and provable selfhood. CDU.IT is the only time he used the abbreviation. The page was later found torn from the log book, preserved only through a carbon duplicate submitted to the Board of Physicians. From there, the term propagated without ownership, for hospitals across 3 states reported its presence. In each instance, it was written in red ink. Not the rust-hued iron gall ink standard to record-keeping, but a brighter, more modern pigment inconsistent with their supply catalogs. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The style of script varied, but all shared an irregularity in the letter O, which tended to be open at the top, suggesting the mark of a stenographer trained outside conventional clerical instruction. No attending physicians claimed authorship. When inquiries were made, most responded with confusion. Some denied ever seeing the term. Others remarked they assumed it was introduced by a consulting authority or federal auditor, though no such officials had been recorded visiting their wards. In one notable case at TU, Belelford Children's Infirmary in Maryland, a page bearing the phrase was removed entirely from a girl's file after a staff member questioned its origin. When the file was next reviewed by the board, the diagnosis was replaced with a blank sheet and a stamped message not applicable. Refer to source case. No further reference to the source case could be found. At St. Augustine's, the term reemerged quietly in a requisition form for sedatives, initialed but unsigned. The form contained no patient name, but cited instance 12, the internal shorthand used by staff for the girl previously assigned to room 12. Dr. Corwin had by then departed the facility, and his successor, Dr. Ailey, recorded in a private letter. The patient's original diagnosis was never formalized. Instead, we inherit phrases like threads of a coat we are no longer allowed to wear. The emotional detachment in Ailey's tone was characteristic of the era, but the note's phrasing betrayed deeper strain. He later requested reassignment, citing vertigo and memory loss. As the phrase continued to spread, it appeared less as a medical explanation and more as a categorical marker, applied to patients who did not respond to chronology, logic, or linear treatment. One child refused to acknowledge her own reflection, insisting it answered incorrectly. Another spoke of family members who had not yet been born, naming them with unsettling specificity that in all cases, the common symptom was not hallucination, but sequence inversion, memories without cause, responses without stimuli, emotions detached from known events. A physician at the Mayfield Neurological Asylum, perhaps unknowingly, offered the most succinct definition. These patients believe they are in the wrong version of themselves. They speak of the present as if it has already been replaced. And yet, the medical board issued no directive, no fo. The male classification was adopted. The term cognitive dissonance of a natural origin remained unratified, used but never owned. By 1877, its use declined. It faded from the ledgers as quickly as it appeared. But a final copy remained, stamped into the rear blank of a surgical index book at St. Augustine's in red ink, without author, date, or case number. Only one line accompanied it. Initial usage verified. Return unnecessary. The book's cover, though labeled 1875, bore an embossing misaligned by exactly 6 years. Among the lesser-known archives of St. Augustine's Infirmary, preserved not in medical records, but in a mislabeled personnel folder, lies a single-page memorandum stamped internal use only and signed without a name. The seal affixed to its margin is not the hospital's nor that of any known medical board. The document is dated April 1875 and issued under a classification most staff had never encountered. Standard Obscure Protocol. The body of the memo reads, effective immediately for any staff assigned to or having prior contact with subject 427C is child. Remove all recollection of the 5 minutes prior to engagement. Do not attempt recall. Do not cross-reference notes. No memory is preferable to flawed memory. The phrase flawed memory appears 5 times in the hospital's history. 4 oft-those instances occur within this single memo. The 5th is found scrolled in the margin of Dr. Corwin's final note before retirement, where he had crossed through his own observations and written only, I remember remembering, but not what. Following the issuance of the directive, changes in staff behavior were immediate and marked. Nurses who had previously described the child's behaviors in elaborate if clinical detail began responding with vague detachment. One nurse, Ellery, who had once kept a personal ledger of the child's posture and pacing, was asked during a routine review about her observations. Her response, recorded by a junior supervisor, read, I'm sorry. I don't believe I was ever assigned to room 12. Her initials appear no fewer than 41 times in the treatment log. Orderly tasked with nightly checks began omitting room 12 entirely from their rounds. Some left blanks where the initials had once been. Others simply noted NA, a notation reserved for empty rooms or those under fumigation. Yet supply records showed consistent use of linen medicine and food in HARS 12 through the summer of 1875. More telling was the handwriting shift. Multiple staff members, when writing near references to the child's case, produced erratic penmanship, slanted characters, uneven spacing, mirrored letters. A handwriting analyst reviewing the records decades later noted that several entries resembled deliberate avoidance more than error, and then entire swaths of interaction simply vanished. In the surgical log for June 12, 1875, a procedure was documented involving the removal of a small foreign object, an embedded sliver of glass from a pediatric patient. The entry lists no name. The physician's signature is only an initial. The surgical tray used matches those reserved exclusively for the West Wing. Yet, no follow-up is recorded. The patient is not listed in the recovery register. The name of the anesthetist is absent. The page following the entry has been glued to the backing board of the ledger, obscuring whatever may have been written beneath. When asked years later about the girl in room 12, surviving staff gave answers that oscillated between denial and incomprehension. One former ward Claire, in a sworn deposition from 1890, insisted that room 12 had remained empty during his tenure. His name, however, appears as the recipient of 3 internal memos addressed specifically to Ward 12 oversight. There was, by all appearances, an effort not to misremember, but to install memory absences deliberately. The language of forgetting had become institutional. You could see the bottom of the blank spot memo, barely visible beneath layers of water damage and ink fade. A final line emerges under raking light. If memory persists longer than instruction permits, report for review under Tier 2 recalibration. No such tier is listed in any hospital governance manual, and no staff were ever recorded as being treated for overattention. What remains are signatures missing from their own documents, keys logged but never returned, and a growing emptiness in the administrative spine of the hospital itself, a room that remained occupied, even when no one remembered who lay inside. By the winter of 1876, strange behavioral patterns began appearing in the casework of pediatric hospitals outside the bounds of St. Augustine's. Reports from Wilmington, Annapolis, and Harrisburg each detailed children, previously without notable affliction, suddenly exhibiting a shared symptom, temporal misplacement, not a loss of memory, but an inversion of order. One child in Pennsylvania insisted a physician had already spoken words he had not yet uttered. Another in Maryland completed arithmetic lessons before the problem had been presented aloud. In each case, no organic cause was found, but in the margins of at least 4 of the case files appeared a phrase that had already begun circulating in quiet suspicion. Cognitive dissonance of unnatural origin, and signed, written in the same red ink as that which had appeared in the St. Augustine ledgers. It was during this period that a group of civilian medical researchers convening under the East Coast Pediatric Collegium began informal correspondence regarding the possibility of an originating case. Their inquiries led them by way of indirect references, duplicated documents, and unfiled requisition slips to Room 12 at St. Augustine's Infirmary. Though the patient's name could not be located, the file number 427C child surfaced through a surviving dietary requisition signed by Dr. Corwin 3 years prior. A formal petition was drafted, signed by 14 physicians across 5 institutions and addressed to the Office of Federal Medical Oversight, then seated in Baltimore. The letter included a respectful request for access to the child's file for non-governmental academic review, citing the appearance of identical symptoms in 3 separate counties. The signatories included respected names in early pediatric neurology, most of whom had served in Union Army hospitals during the war and were known for their imperi colligar. The letter was sent by post on March 8, 1876. Its arrival was never recorded. When no reply had been received by April, 2 of the signatories traveled in person to the Baltimore office. They were told no such petition had ever been received. A review of incoming mail logs for that week showed a suspicious absence. 4 entries skipped without explanation, their logbook numbers missing from the sequence. The clerical secretary on duty had resigned the following morning due to what she termed in her resignation slip as cognitive fatigue inconsistent with task volume. 3 weeks later, one of the petition's original drafters, Dr. Wickham of New Haven, received a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a single folded page. It bore no salutation, no signature, only a single typed line. Your curiosity has been noted. It is not contagious unless permitted. The letter was never shown to the board. Wickham ceased further correspondence on the matter. In the Collegium's annual proceedings, the incident was never recorded. No mention was made of the vanished petition, nor of the file it sought to retrieve. One of the signatories, Dr. Beale, who had been vocal about institutional resistance to new classification models, was reassigned to a clerical post in a sanatorium for aging war veterans. His final recorded lecture simply read, "Time is not a symptom. It is a wound." No file marked 427C child was ever archived at the Baltimore office. Its existence was later deemed non-verifiable. The original carbon copy of the petition kept by Dr. Wickham in his study was discovered burned inside his hearth after his passing in 1892. Only the signature line remained intact. 14 names precisely spaced, and 1 line above them faintly visible through the scorched paper. Patient record sealed under classification Lottie's exposure civilian tie. That classification does not appear in any declassified index of federal medical codes, nor has it since. In the spring of 1904, 30 years after a first documented entry of file 427C child, a single gelatin silver print surfaced at a private estate auction in Charlottesville, Kansas. The image, measuring 4x6 in, bore no identifying marks other than a pinkled number on the back. 12. It had been stored between 2 hymnals inside a box of estate miscellane from the now demolished eastern annex of St. Augustine's Infirmary. The room it captured was unremarkable in appearance. A simple cotwool blanket tucked with military precision. A wooden chair positioned beside a washstand. The paint on the walls was flaking in even strokes. A pattern of neglect rather than damage. Light filtered in from the south-facing window, softened by soot on the glass. At first glance, The photo might have been mistaken for any number of hospital recovery rooms typical of the era, but it was the mirror that drew attention. Hung on the far wall, rectangular and bordered by lacquered cherrywood, the mirror reflected the bed from the opposite angle, and in that reflection, the bed displayed two distinct impressions, one deep, the full weight off a sleeping body. The other more faint, shallow as if formed by someone smaller or someone sitting only briefly before vanishing. The original bed, as captured directly in the foreground, showed only a single indentation. The discrepancy was initially thought to be a photographic flaw, light doubling, lens warping, or silver emulsion instability. Yet, forensic analysis conducted in 1911 by the Bureau of Archival Preservation in Philadelphia found no evidence of double exposure or damage to the negative, which had been discovered shortly after the print itself. A report from that examination states, "The mirror image presents structural integrity consistent with original reflection, no retouching, no composite layering, mirror position firm, refined." Discrepancy unexplained. The photograph sparked renewed interest in Room 12, which by 1904 had been bricked over during the facility's partial conversion into a home for invalid veterans. No formal plans for the room's closure exist. The only surviving architectural drawing of the West Wing shows Room 11 adjoining Room 13 directly. No mention of the intervening space. Staff interviews from that time reflect confusion. One nurse on staff during the 1890s remarked in an unsigned affidavit, "That room always had a mirror, but I don't recall anyone cleaning it. I don't recall anyone looking into it either." The mirror itself was no longer affixed to the wall by the time investigators returned to examine the room in 1906. Its absence was noted in the ward maintenance log, but without detail. The page reads, "Only removed per storage directive. Tag 11B. No storage tag bearing that number was found in the hospital's possession." An inquiry to the Department of Interior's Office of Surplus Furnishings project said no matches. Dr. Matthias L. Wood, an early photographic archivist and amateur historian, kept the image pinned above his desk until his death in 1933 inches the margins of his journal he had written beside it. Impression without presence, reflection without source, a contradiction only visible when not sought. His family burned most of his papers upon his passing, citing coherence in tone and obsessive scribbling. The photograph, however, was spared, sold later with other oddities to a collector in Maine. That collector, William D. Grounds, claimed the glass of the frame cracked clean through on its first night in his possession. Despite no fall or pressure, he never replaced the pane. To this day, the photograph remains in private hands. No official registry contains a copy. The original negative, once stored with the Pennsylvania Bureau, is missing from the archive. In its place, a note slipped inside the file sleeve, typed in block print, "Duplicate verified, original, no longer applicable." The paper it's typed on is identical in grain and weight to the notes used at St. Augustine's, except for one difference. Its watermark reads 1912, not 1904. In the catalog of the U.S. Army Medical Division's Internal Archive, between case studies on battlefield nerve trauma and autopsy reports from the Panama Canal expeditions, lies a single sheet of paper. It is neither dated nor indexed by standard classification. Its ink has browned at the edges, suggesting age. Yet the paper remains unnaturally preserved, smooth, almost oiled. It is filed under a rarely used administrative tag, even tunverified. At the top of the page in faded typescript are 3 lines of redacted text. Black bars evenly spaced obscuring both heading and apparent introduction. What remains visible lies beneath, typed in a distinct serif font inconsistent with the Army's 1870s standard issue typewriters. It reads, "I am one of 3. The others are pending." There is no signature, no case number, no header, no physical record of who submitted the document or to what file it once belonged. The handwriting present only in the final period, as if the sentence had been completed manually after the type bars fell silent, has been analyzed for authorship, but no match has been found in federal personnel databases. The dot itself is slightly misaligned, resting below the text's baseline, a flaw too deliberate to be accidental. The phrase first came to scholarly attention in 1954 when military archivists conducting an internal audit of anomalous case files were asked to identify documents linked to non-competent medical anomalies. Of the 14 documents pulled under the even unverified category, this page was the only one not directly associated with the known patient or research facility. Yet upon magnification of the upper right margin, a faint numerical stamp is visible. 427C. The same designation used at St. Augustine's Infirmary 3 decades prior. No other materials in the Army Archive carry this stamp. The language itself, plain declarative, offers no immediate context, but its implications sparked internal review. The notion of 3, as it appears here, was not echoed in any of the girl's known hospital records. Nowhere in the treatment logs or physician notes is there a reference to duplication or multiplication, and yet, threads emerge. In Nurse Lydia Marsh's hidden diary unearthed in 1892, a sketch appears of 2 identical girls, both displaying the same mannerisms, the same fixation on nonlinear time. One, she writes, was taken away, the other remained, and the bed, even after the latter's departure, still bore 2 impressions in the mirror. In a separate hospital requisition from 1876, now preserved in the Richmond Municipal Warehouse, a physician's scroll appears in the supply margin. Do not admit more than 1 at a time. Delay the others. Dispersal disrupts containment. The request was unsigned. No reference to thirst exists in the body of the request. The handwriting has never been matched. Psychological profiling of Thiecase's primary physician, Dr. Corwin, noted an increasing fixation with spatial and numeric compartmentalization his final months at St. Augustine's. In one of his private notebooks, a torn scrap remains with only this written at the center. 1 is manageable, 2 is a misalignment, 3 opens a door. He was never interviewed following his retirement, and his personal effects were seized by a federal office now defunct. The document itself remains under review. In 1971, during microfiche conversion, the typist tasked with copying its contents wrote a memo to her supervisor. It reads, "The file is incomplete. It has no beginning and it has no end. I can only transcribe the sentence it leaves behind." The sentence has since been entered into 3 archival indexes, but in 2 of them, the quote reads, "I am 2 of 3. The other is pending." No corrections were issued. No explanation was provided, and the originals, when checked against the scanned record, are missing. In 1921, amidst a routine transfer of outdated medical holdings from a closed military depot in central Kansas to a federal cryptographic research facility in Prince George's County, Maryland, a shipment was recorded that did not fit the inventory. The shipment log, typed on carbon paper and filed under anatomical holdings non-combatant, listed various biological samples slated for disposal or reclassification. Most were marked with conventional descriptors: tissue slides, bone fragments, formalin jars, relics from turn-of-the-century autopsies deemed non-essential. But midway down the page, beneath a shipment of optic nerves preserved in carbolic acid, appeared a single entry. Subject 4227, juvenile female, preserved brain section, marked temporal disarray. No corresponding death certificate exists. No surgical record. Coroner's notation or institutional report lists the removal of a brain section from any juvenile, matching the 427 designation. And most notably, no facility involved in the transfer identified itself as having custody of a full body at the time. The implication was not just that she had died, but that she had been anatomized. Yet nowhere in any archive is her death mentioned. Notat St. Augustine's, not in any military medical log, not in the annual mortality tables compiled for federal review. The brain tissue was cataloged without a preservation date. The term temporal disarray, rarely used in anatomical contexts, appears to have originated from an adjacent discipline, one more associated with cryptographic deviation than pathology. The sample was assigned not to a medical laboratory, but to a subdivision of the Signal Intelligence Service, which in the 1920s had begun expanding its research into what it termed nonlinear data sets and biological errata. Internal memos from the facility declassified decades later under unrelated proceed. Dings contain oblique references to a juvenile specimen used during early cognitive mapping studies. One scientist, writing in a letter to a colleague at MIT, mentions an asymmetrical hemisphere with collapsed long-term clustering, followed by the remark, "No electrical stimulation required, pattern per-existing." That pattern was never defined. At no point was the sample ever assigned a patient name. Only the numerical reference remained 4227C. Its provenance was listed as Unspecified Army Archive Cold Storage Vault 4. That vault no longer exists. The building was demolished in 1936 to make way for a water treatment expansion. The archival floor plans for Vault 4 do not show storage for medical containers, only cipher disks, encrypted paper reels, and sealed courier satchels. Those who handled the shipment later noted the sample was contained in an unusually weighted canister lined with both lead and brass, though the material inside weighed no more than 100 g. The lid had no locking mechanism, but bore a brass medallion engraved with a non-standard sigil. 3 concentric circles, Thaner 2 broken at offset intervals. The meaning of the symbol has not been traced to any known military or scientific body. No further record of the sample exists after 1922 in 1943. During a paper purge at the facility, a handwritten manifest was recovered from the furnace room, partially charred. Among the few lines still legible is a reference to a preserved juvenile cortex, pending with the word retrieved written beside it in a different hand. The only marginal note on the document reads, "Identity loop not closed. Contained until reentry stabilizes." There is no known medical or cryptographic definition for an identity loop. There is no autopsy on file, and the shipment that followed 4227C in the ledger-marked specimen 428M, adult male cardiac deviation, was redacted entirely in 1958. Its existence erased from all subsequent archives. Viewed at the bottom of the shipment page, in faint graphite beneath the typed entries, someone had added a final note, "Do not reclassify." The girl was never declared dead. In the cavernous sub-levels of the Pentagon's archival wing, beneath layers of outdated telecommunication charts and misfiled transportation logs, a researcher cataloging civilian medical overlaps stumbled upon a page that, by its heading alone, should not have existed. The paper, aged but intact, bore the emblem of the United States War Department, affixed not to a soldier's name, nor to battlefield statistics, but to a psychiatric memorandum dated 1876 that IT was filed among defense preparedness papers wedged between 2 unrelated documents concerning munitions rail schedules. The subject line read, "Instability of linear identity among pre-language minors." No agency, civilian or military, has ever formally adopted this phrase into diagnostic practice. No known medical or academic institution, even in experimental settings, has recorded this classification. The memo contains no physician's name, no hospital, no direct attribution, only a 5-digit reference code for 27C. The body of the memo, brief and without introductory language, describes a non-combatant juvenile subject whose perception of temporal progression was non-causal, non-replicable, and internally consistent across contradictory memory states. It continues, subject exhibits capacity for pre-retentive recall. Behavior aligns with temporal paradox modeling. Identity persists despite external rearrangement. Nowhere does the report specify how this data was acquired. No observer is named. No incident report or witness interview is attached. And yet, under a bold red-stamped header labeled National Defense Tier 3, the following warning is affixed at the bottom. Do not reintroduce. Containment is preferable to replication. Instability precedes awareness. The memo represents the first recorded instance of a civilian psychiatric observation being filed directly under federal military classification. Notably, it precedes the official founding of the Pentagon by over 60 years, implying that the structure of defense record-keeping had, even then, reserved space for such unverified yet protected anomalies. Later analysis of the phrase "do not reintroduce" suggests this was not a warning of social reintegration, but rather of biological recurrence. An implication supported by a subsequent cross-reference in a 1914 Army intelligence draft on inherited behavioral disruptions. That draft cites a lost file labeled C3 variant origin albumel. The psychological tone of the memo is neither alarmist nor speculative. Its detachment is bureaucratic, as if the event in question were neither shocking nor recent, but a known phenomenon for which policies already existed. Its composure is what disturbed the archivist most. Marginalia discovered on the rear of the document added in graphite decades later reads, Third confirmation off non-looping identity drift recurred in female minors only. Phenotype unrepeatable post-1900. There is no accompanying citation, and the term non-looping identity drift has not been recorded in any other military or medical document before or since. Dr. Edwin Larose, a behavioral neurologist consulted during the document's review in 1972, observed that the language echoed what he had once seen in early discarded drafts of cognitive encryption proposals where human thought was treated not as a product of memory, but as a trajectory. In his notes, he wrote, "This reads less like a diagnosis or like a boundary marker where understanding was instructed to stop." The document was quietly refiled under a sealed index labeled Discontinued Behavioral Research Civilian Exceptions. Its reference code was altered to remove the 427 designation, but the microfilm copy remains unchanged and the subject line still reads in full instable, it of linear identity among pre-language minors. The most curious feature of the page, however, is its watermark. Though the memo is dated 1876, the watermark, visible only under sodium light, displays a year not yet reached at the time of its filing. Paper manufactured 1899.NO investigation followed. No amendment was issued, and no paper mill by that name existed in 1876. In the early summer of 1922, a woman appeared without announcement at the edge of Pembroke Hollow, a hamlet of less than 40 residents nestled in the foothills of Kansas County. She arrived barefoot, wearing a muslin shift discolored by age and exposure, her hair uncombed, her fingernails dirt-lined but unbroken. She bore no satchel, no letter of introduction, no identification, only a scrap of stiff paper held tightly in one hand. She was observed first by a grocer's apprentice who later recorded in an affidavit notarized at the county seat that the woman spoke like someone who had only just left supper, not like someone lost. When asked who she was, the woman reportedly replied, "I was just at the hospital." There had been no operational hospital in Pembroke Hollow for over 2 decades. The nearest facility, St. Augustine's Infirmary, had ceased admissions in 1895 and stood in partial ruin. Its west wing collapsed and its files dispersed during the federal sanitarium redistribution. When local lawmen approached, the woman named several individuals as staff: Dr. Lawrence Corwin, Nurse Lydia Marsh, Superintendent Latimer. All 3 had been deceased for more than 30 years. She listed their positions accurately. She identified the now buried structure of the infirmary by its original interior layout. She used the phrase Room 12 with certainty. The county records Claire, who was asked to verify her identity, reported no birth certificate matching her appearance or stated age. Her physical condition suggested a woman in her early 40s. Her language, though clear, carried traces of 19th century construction. Words like fumigant, ward slips, and blank side, a term used historically in reference to unmarked medical sheets, had fallen out of use by 1900. Most curious was the object she carried. The page clutched in her hand was approximately 4 in width and torn in an uneven curve across the top. Its backing was silvered and flaked, consistent with reflective coating used in the manufacturing of mirrors from the 1870s. The underside bore no writing, no watermark, but pressed faintly into the surface was an impression raised, not inked, as if it had once rested behind another sheet under heavy pressure. When dusted, the impression revealed 9 words. This version is not the original. Do not follow. The phrase's origin remains unidentified. No ledger, letter, or known record has matched it in phrasing or structure. The page was later cataloged by the Albemarle Historical Society under specimen unclassified local recovered, but was removed from its case in 1937 during a storage consolidation and never refiled. The woman's psychological profile, recorded over a 48-hour period at the county house, showed no signs of delusion, aggression, or trauma. She requested no food but consumed water regularly. She refused bedding. She did not sleep. When asked about her memory, she gave one answer repeatedly: "I left, but I did not exit." A Claire assigned to record her responses noted that she sometimes paused mid-sentence as though waiting for another voice to catch up. She was eventually transferred to a state facility in Staten, where she was assigned no diagnosis and placed under observation. Within 1 week, her file was marked unplaceable, custodian unretainable. She vanished the following morning. The final entry in her intake log, signed by an orderly named Elridge, reads, "Bed unused, water cup full, note left blank." No trace of her clothing or the mirror shard was recovered. But in a corner of the staff ledger, where signatures were required before transfer, one entry appears in a different hand: neat, practiced, unfaded time. There is no staff member known by that number, and that page, unlike the others, bears no crease down the spine, as though it had never been turned. In the waning months of 1947, following a post-war reorganization of military medical intelligence, a restricted internal review was commissioned to examine a handful of pre-20th century civilian medical cases that had at one point or another crossed into federal jurisdiction. The resulting report, never intended for public release, was labeled Initial Assessments of Legacy Containment Incidents, Biological and Cognitive Outliers. Among the entries, many involving outdated disease control failures or untraceable physiological deformities, was a singular reference to an unnamed pediatric subject from 1934. The document called it only the 1934 anomaly. The passage concerning her was brief and almost mechanical in tone. It read, "Subject presented with more than one temporal signature. Identity fixation unresolvable across linear sequencing. Case required suppression due to risk of propagation via maternal inheritance. Indicators suggest anomaly was not isolated to individual instance, and no further elaboration followed. The phrasing more than one temporal signature was not defined nor contextualized. Yet within the internal glossary attached to the report, a term appears that does not exist in any other known federal file. Dyschronological symptom expression, the manifestation of cognitive orientation untethered from chronological placement. The implication inferred by the reviewing committee was that the girl from room 12 had not simply exhibited confusion or trauma-induced displacement, but had expressed a neurological identity divorced from sequential causality, not forward or backward in time, but unfixed within it. Further marginalia in the report suggests her behavior was later interpreted through an inherited lens, as if what had first appeared to be an isolated psychosis had revealed patterns that decades later emerged again. The review included this SE tense: "Had we not acted, this pattern may have spread through maternal inheritance." The word maternal was underlined by hand and in a different ink than the original typewritten document. No genetic study of the time, nor any prior to it, considered behavioral orientation toward time a heritable trait. And yet the sentence was preserved unedited through 3 departmental transitions. The name of the girl, never recorded in the file, was not the omission. It was the point. No personal data was attached, no hospital listed, no reference to St. Augustine's, only the case's classification. National Security, Tier 3 non-combatant. The same tier used decades earlier in the Pentagon memo titled Instability of Linear Identity Among Pre-Language Minors. Toward the end of the 1947 report, a single page was handwritten unlike the others and inserted without formal formatting or identification. It was unsigned and dated only with the month October. The page bore one sentence: "There are children still alive today. Check the years they ask about." No appendix followed. No location was specified. The file was closed thereafter and stamped review suspended in red ink. It was never reopened. 1 month later, the Defense Medical Records Division issued a quiet memorandum to its regional offices stating that cases involving non-sequential cognition in minors were to be forwarded directly to D.C., bypassing standard medical review. No physician was to be notified of the request. The policy remained in place until 1956. When archivists revisited the file in the early 1980s, they discovered a discrepancy. The folder labeled 1934 Anomaly contained only 14 pages, but the index card affixed to its front listed 50. The missing page was not marked missing. It was simply gone, and the last listed document on the card, never recovered, bore a curious title not found anywhere else in the Federal Archive. Cross-variant entry points: Child A, Child B, placeholder. The placeholder's name had been penciled in, then erased. The indent remains, shallow, deliberate, and still legible beneath the pressure of decades. Child C. The file was sealed. The room wasp-bricked over, and the names, those that once filled the margins, were erased from every ledger that dared to record them. But remnants always surface in basement, in blueprints. In sentences Noon remembers writing. If you've seen patterns like this, misplaced records, mirrored rooms, paths that vanish mid-step, leave them in the comments below. Others are watching quietly, and some of them. Remember, like this video if the map still opens for you. Subscribe if you're willing to keep turning pages that were never meant to be found. And whatever you do, don't look for room 13. It was never drawn, but it answers.